What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by author and podcaster Drew Weatherhead. Drew has a podcast called The Social Disorder that he started as a pandemic project and has since bloomed into a broader search for truth. We talk about how science can be corrupted and influenced by ideologies and why it's important to question and critically analyze all scientific claims. We chat about how human beings are susceptible to getting caught up in ideas that don't align with the facts or reality. And we even talk about what the antidote to totalitarianism might be. Drew is also an author. He has one book that is readily available to you on Amazon called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. And he has a second book entitled Layers of Truth that is available for pre-order on Amazon as well and comes out April 1st. So I'm really excited for this conversation. It took a turn and a direction that I was not expecting. We even talk about God and faith and what that looks like in the day that we're living in. I really enjoyed this. I hope you do too. So, Drew Weatherhead, welcome to the show. So, Waco, Texas. It looks sunny and warm there. What's that like?
Yeah, it's not bad right now. We've had a little bit of rainstorms, but it's nothing to be concerned about. It's full on spring, kind of coming into summer at this point.
How warm is it right now?
Average day to day is somewhere between like 20 and 25 degrees.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
I was just looking out my back door this morning while I was eating some breakfast, and I was like, this is actually, in my opinion, one of the most exciting times of the year in Ontario, because that all of the best weather is just, a few weeks ahead of where you are right now.
Right.
And
so you got some
really
anticipation.
Really, really soon, you're going to start feeling that warmth and you're going to feel the sun. And I love being outside and I have a huge connection to the outdoors. So I really revel in that idea. And at this point in time, you just get to sit on top of the fact that you have all of the summer and fall ahead of you. And I just really enjoy that.
It's the absolute opposite feeling is like October there, right? Where you feel like you've burnt all of your matches and you're down to the last supply.
Yeah, I absolutely felt that way. But the best thing I did, I used to feel like I had seasonal affective disorder, which is when you basically get sad when the weather's sad. And maybe to a certain extent I do, but ever since I took up hunting, I just got new reasons to be excited for kind of the less pleasant months of the year. So the summer is amazing because the weather's really, really good, but there's no hunting season. But there's a hunting season for turkey in the spring, and there's a hunting season for turkey and deer in the fall. So as we're kind of winding down that beautiful summer weather and everyone's getting sad and upset that it's getting colder, I'm like gearing up to go into the woods to go shoot a deer, and I just get so excited about it. So I haven't found yet a reason to love January, but I'm working on it. So you were saying you're in Waco. How much time have you spent there, and where else have you been this year?
Yeah. Most of this 6 months period that we were down, we spent in Florida around the Orlando area, but also over to the West Coast. So that was really nice. We haven't done a whole lot of, I guess it is below Tampa and just above Fort Myers. So beautiful, beautiful area.
Yeah, nice. And so you were saying that the West Coast of Florida is underrated. Why?
100%. Yeah, well, I mean, Florida typically has this reputation for the East Coast, which is where Miami is. It's where Long Beach is. It's the party scene. It's got a massive international airport. It's just, to me, that's not my vibe for one. But for two, it's basically a different country. Like, I don't know if you've been down to the Miami area or Southern California Florida for very long, but you almost feel like you're a minority there in an English-speaking country because almost everybody is primarily Spanish-speaking, whether they came from Puerto Rico or Cuba or Mexico or who knows what. But it's strange in that if that's what you're going there for, sure. But I am living in America and it feels like I've just sort of tripped over this invisible border into some other foreign land where I don't, people are looking at me weird. I have to try to learn a little bit of Spanish to go to a gas station kind of thing. And it's not everywhere, but it's definitely not like that on the West Coast where it feels like, okay, we're still in America and there's there's something about the lack of the party scene that really appeals to me too, because on the west side, it's more about retirees. It's more about like the local people that are there. And it feels more like Florida with Floridians, which if you listen to the memes sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually not that bad.
Yeah, there's plenty of good Florida man memes to go around.
Those are mostly from northern Florida, like Jacksonville.
Yeah, so that's actually there's something that people say about Florida. The further north in Florida you go, the more south you get.
Yes, that's exactly it.
And I love that because I love the South. The South is probably my favorite place in America. And it's like, it can be a lot, but there's just, there's a craziness in the South, especially the deep South, that I just think is so fun.
Yeah, we were in New Orleans for a few days, and you want to talk about deep South. That was amazing. Incredible.
I spent a couple of days in New Orleans, maybe 3 to 5 days before they had their massive
Mardi Gras?
Their massive COVID outbreak that happened in New Orleans right at the beginning of COVID. And what's funny about that is the people, myself included, that I was traveling with, all ended up getting sick right when we came home, and we probably all brought COVID back to Canada, but none of us knew that that's what was happening.
You were actually the plague rats.
Yeah, we are Canadian patient zeros, so cheers to that. Man, it's so great to have you back. I get excited every time I get to talk to you. I think you're such an interesting dude. You do so many interesting things. Why don't we start at your podcast? I wanted to ask you about your podcast because it's called the Social Disorder Podcast. And I'm imagining, if I remember correctly, was this originally a pandemic project?
Yeah, primarily it was. It definitely started from that. It's evolved since then, but we still cover stuff as it needs to be covered. But yeah, more or less it was a reaction to the censorship and honestly just the insanity of the time. This started literally one day before the invocation of the Emergencies Act. February 13th was the first episode. And look, I didn't know that the Emergencies Act was about to be invoked the next day, but You didn't have an inside key in on it? Trudeau didn't let me know about that one. I thought we were buddies, but no. It was that, like, just to give you a barometer of the temperature of the times when it happened. Like, I was at a boiling point at that point culturally, and I wasn't even in Canada. I had already fled with my family as of November, or just before November, actually. We left a week before we actually weren't allowed to fly, which was our only out at that point as unvaccinated people in Canada. It was our only way out of the country, and we needed to get out because we had just we folded our business because of mandates and restrictions breaking our back financially. We sold our house and put our whole family into a travel trailer and had to get that travel trailer across the American border to do the 6-month thing because you simply can't winter in Alberta of all places, but Canada in general over the winter. And so we had like a week window to not only get our unit across the southern border, which was impossible for us to do. We had to have an American friend drive it across who was a dual citizen. And then we had to fly our family across the border before we weren't allowed to fly anymore, which was only a week away because Trudeau had just been elected. And one of his election promises was a punitive travel restriction on unvaccinated people, which, by the way, we found out after the fact. Even though we kind of knew during the fact, there was no science to back it whatsoever.
Yeah, the biggest one, it was maybe about a year ago. Did you see? I'm sure you did, in the Dutch Parliament when they were cross-examining some of the executives from Pfizer. Mm-hmm. They admitted that they had zero data and hadn't even tested as to whether or not it restricted transmission of the virus.
Yeah, they were working at the speed of science, Zach. What do you want?
Well, of course, the speed of
That's
science.
What they said. They said we were working at the speed of science.
Yeah, we had to do the right thing. We needed a vaccine. But so, like, fair enough. But the crazy thing is, and it's so bananas, that was not the message we got from the government. The message from the government was, you need to take this so that you can't give it to more people so that we can stop it. And there was literally zero science. 0% science.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that, Zach, because there was a court finding over a year after the travel restrictions were invoked and had already, lasted 8 months. Over a year after that, there was a court discovery that brought the people that were from Trudeau's cabinet that kept saying cabinet confidentiality. We can't say anything, but they gleaned enough out of them to basically say that they were instructed to find some science to back this thing. So the decision was already made from Trudeau that we have to do this thing. We have to restrict the travel of unvaccinated people. Please find me some science that makes this make sense. And they struggled and they strained for like 4 weeks to try to find anything that backed it scientifically. They came back to him and said, we can't find anything. And he said, do it anyways. That came out in court. So we know that there was no science and that they tried to find something to justify it. They even hired a guy by the name of Feisman. You heard of Feisman?
No, I haven't.
Okay. There's a whole book on it called, actually, I think it's pronounced Fisman. Fisman's Fraud. Check out Fisman's Fraud. It's by a statistician I had on my show. And she details scientifically and like at a statistician level how this was a fraudulent, scientific mathematical model that was, it was paid for by the government of Canada and subsidized by Pfizer to prove that unvaccinated people transmit more than vaccinated people do. And this was given the go-ahead about the same time as the travel restrictions were coming up. But of course, working at the speed of science took him till about January to release the findings. And at that point, it had already been obvious that there was no science behind this. And all of a sudden, this scientific model comes out that shows that, all along it was okay, because it turns out that now that we have the science that unvaccinated people spread it more. But then you go into the actual data and the way that they ran their science, and it's totally fraudulent. The whole book written on it. So they were straining in every way, shape, and form politically to try to prove something scientifically that was objectively not the case.
Yeah, that's a hard lesson I learned over the course of the pandemic, is that you can pretty much prove anything you want. You can make the numbers work in any way you want. You just have to find a way to do it. And I didn't really see the scientific method like that, but funding plays a huge role in it. And, people, the reality is that studies are run for an outcome. They're paid for by people to get an outcome so that they can say, look at this outcome. And then usually in the case of medicine, that's followed up with, here's a drug that does something about it. And I just didn't anticipate that that science was going to be like that. It didn't really make sense to me. But I guess everything at the end of the day is driven by money. And science can make you money if you do the science correctly, whether or not it's actually a full picture of what's going on.
Well, it even goes deeper than that, and I learned that same lesson over the pandemic, but I learned more lessons, especially as I was continuing my podcast, talking to a bunch of different people that were affected in a bunch of different ways and a bunch of different worldviews. And what I found was, yes, of course, everybody can be affected by money. Money is the great lever in society, right? They say that money is the root of all kinds of evil. You can do anything with enough money, basically. If someone has a price, they can be bought. We all know that. It gets worse than that, though, when it gets tied into worldviews and ideologies. And there was a certain amount of that was playing out. And one of them was the preeminence of science as the fix-all, the solve-all, the answer to everything. And there was a shroud around the orthodoxy of science. Science as like a noun, not as a verb. You weren't doing the action of science. Science was this orthodoxical practice that had bishops and priests and cardinals and popes. And you got to learn all their names from their positions in the medical bureaucracy. When it turned out that they needed to do the actual science, they kept it very quiet, very censored. Nobody really spoke out, and it felt a whole lot like you were trapped inside of an orthodoxy again. And this is the ideology that I think it wasn't as obviously prevalent beforehand. You could, if you were in the know, there were certain people that got bitten by stepping to the heterodox fringe of that orthodoxy, but they were sort of one-off cases. When the whole society was basically gaslit into believing that the science was going to take care of them, while they saw objectively that it wasn't, there was much more of an awakening, I think, to what was supposed to be a objective process of you start with a hypothesis and, you work towards a theory and the whole scientific thing, right? Turns out that's not exactly how science is done, and certainly not as the science as a noun presented itself. It was much more of human ego, human arrogance, human hubris, and a lot of what you expect from politics, except in science. And I don't think a lot of people knew that that was the case. And once they started recognizing that, there was a very prevalent ideology that presented itself.
Yeah, science as a religion is something that definitely happened, and you nailed it. You nailed it on the head when you said. So what science is supposed to be is you're supposed to start with a hypothesis, and then you're supposed to objectively try to prove that hypothesis through experiments. And if the experiments...
You try to prove it wrong. You start with an observation, try to make a hypothesis and prove it wrong, and if you can't, you get a theory. It's supposed to be a great process, but, continue on, sorry.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the clarification. But what I discovered, and many others discovered, was actually happening is that instead of starting with a hypothesis, you were starting with an outcome, and then your job was to go through and try to find science that would prove that outcome, because that's the outcome that you wanted, which is not how science is supposed to be conducted at all, is it? Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to ask you about the podcast, because I've been chewing this around myself. So the Social Disorder podcast, it was started during the pandemic. The name itself makes a lot of sense in that context. But, those pandemic days are now further and further behind us. And very quickly, people are kind of relaxing and forgetting about it. And one of the concerns I have is that we're going to miss all of the lessons that were really prevalent and in front of our faces. But it's hard to kind of hold on to that stuff when everyone wants to just go live their lives. So you said earlier on that your podcast has kind of grown and adapted from its original inception. Where do you kind of sit on that stuff now? Like, the original inception was this social disorder, this problem that needed to be looked at and solved. What is it now?
Well, it's grown in a way that it's branched away from specific disorders and more into the meta of disorders within society. So I still do focus primarily on what's wrong with the world, which can seem like a bit of a black pill thing to do, is constantly looking at what's wrong. But by looking at that, it illuminates what could be better too. So it rolled into this ethos of starting with skepticism on top of existentialism. We sort of take this view of both the dark side as opposed to the light side, which illuminates the other side. And I've started to plug in a lot of philosophy actually to the podcast, and old philosophy too. I'm going back to like Socrates and Epictetus and a bunch of the old classics and Stoics, as well as some Buddhist theory and even like religions like Christianity, and starting to plug in more of a holistic framework to try to balance out, instead of just like, what does the science say today? Well, what did the science say yesterday? But what does the science say tomorrow, kind of thing? Like, you're just sort of a cat chasing his tail at that point if you're trying to wait for truth to illuminate itself through something that's just monolithically scientific. And when you plugged in, what I found is when I started plugging in philosophy, which is basically the love of wisdom, that's what that word means in the Latin, you start to gain a tool like a divining rod to find discernment. You use discernment to find truth. And this is actually circuitously what led to the writing of my second book, which I just finished, called Layers of Truth. And I think that the podcast has played a pivotal role in that whole process, because it has become this search for truth.
So, as the host of that podcast, how do you go about, so you're searching for truth. Is it fair to say that that's the point of your podcast at this point?
It is. And really, I think it's more of like the message of we're all searching for truth, and we need to be honest about that. And for anybody who thinks they have it all figured out, you might want to double check where you're actually standing, because when it comes down to it and you need to rely on that divining rod, if you haven't actually been using it and just been onboarding orthodoxies, it's basically like just paying for a subscription model for something that, you get whatever is in that model and that's it. But if you discover that it's inadequate for something, then you're going to have to come back to the point that you have to do your own work. And this is more or less the project and what it's meant for is like, let's look at everything. Let's look at it from the pro, from the con, from the, every angle we can, and try to suss out like what is the actual field that we're working on in here. And I found that very valuable for myself to try to, in such a crazy time during the pandemic, try to find my grounding and my trajectory it's hard to remember nowadays how crazy the news cycle was from day to day, and to try to find like, what should I do next in that environment? It really required the application of stoicism and knowledge and wisdom, and trying to find like what is correct for myself in whatever situation you find yourself in. And so, yeah, to answer your question, that is what the goal of the podcast is now to not only be able to find your own way to discover and discern truth, but to do it for yourself and to be empowered by that.
Yeah. So what are the meta problems that you're observing? And so just, I want to quickly explain the idea of the meta look at something. It's, so in the context, we're talking about science, who have been in the context of science. Let's say there is a problem, and the problem is heart disease. And then 100 people do studies on heart diseases, and they all say different things because they're all different studies. The meta-analysis is taking one step above those 100 studies and averaging out across all of those pieces of information to see what signals repeat. So maybe in 30 of the 100 studies, this one thing about heart disease appeared the same. So you get a greater understanding, and you pick up kind of, well, you're hoping for the truth. So when you do a meta-analysis, you look above the original problem. So looking above COVID, looking above the social disorders that we're seeing in our society. What is your meta-analysis of our current social order?
Well, this has been the project, and yeah, that was a good description. The way that I think of it is like a pulling back of the lens. Like, you can zoom in a lens like a microscope onto the micro. You can pull it back to the macro, but you can pull it back even further than the macro to the meta. And that's when you see like the holistic thing, and you look at things that round out in a way that shows a different sort of pattern. And I think that all of those lens views are important. You need to be able to zoom into the micro for some things, but you can't stay there. You can't just like look at your shoelaces while you're walking forward. You have to pull back and look at the vast surroundings around you and make decisions out of that. It is an incredible tool to use that I think it illuminates a lot of things. And to come back to your question about what am I seeing these days, really, they're all old problems. And I think that this is something that more people and a lot of historians, they see this immediately because it's their worldview, is they look at the present case of humanity, not from how technologically advanced we are, not with what names are in what positions in what countries right now, but kind of like what are the themes through human history that have led us to this point. And what you see is a repeating pattern. There's a lot of repetition that's going on, that you see that, name a thing in society and I can show you its version 100 years ago, And so what that does is, once you recognize that there's a pattern here and that's a repeating pattern, you can go back. And this is what we do constantly. We go back and look at the stories, both the successes of the past and the cautionary tales of the past, and then compare it, to the present. And it's never one for one, but there's that old saying that history rhymes, right? Nothing is exactly the same, but there's something that is very similar to it. And what I'm seeing right now is a similar human move towards collectivism. And this is something that I talked to a recent guest about. I had on G. Edward Griffin, who was the interviewer for that famous interview with Yuri Bezmenov in 1980. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And
I'm sorry. I just want to pause really quickly. Yuri Bezmenov, for those who don't know, I'm going to link this video in the show notes. There's a really interesting presentation. He is an I don't know if he's still with us.
KGB defector.
Yeah, he was a KGB defector. So basically the Russian secret service. And I want to say all the way back in the 80s,
Yeah,
did
84.
did a presentation. I'll link it in the show notes, basically describing from I guess from his experience in the KGB, the Russian perspective or order of how to corrupt a society from the inside out. And it's chilling to watch, because as you watched through it, I watched it during the pandemic, I was looking at what he was saying, and I was watching all of those things happen within our
You hear
society
some
in
rhymes?
Canada. Yeah, it was rhyming. It was super, super creepy. So it's definitely worth a watch. But sorry, I interrupted. Continue.
Yeah, no, but it's important because these are the type of historical things that if you didn't know existed, you would be flabbergasted with what's going on right now because you've never seen anything like it. But people have seen things like it, and more to the point, there are long-term objectives of certain peoples, groups, powers, and really, I think, ideologies and the pressures behind them that are moving in their own trajectory with their own weight and inertia behind them. And what happened in the Soviet Union during the Cold War specifically. So this is post Truman dropping the bombs. This is where we enter this period. I mean, if anybody watched the Oppenheimer movie, that kind of laid out the beginning of the Cold War as Russia started to build their super weapons. And at that point, it was mutually assured destruction. It was, spies over here, spies over there. What are they doing? What are we doing? And that whole thing, and we can run through like the 40 years that presented until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But this interview happened in 84, which I found very interesting because it was kind of leading towards the final collapse in 89 of the Berlin Wall, which led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Little history lesson for everyone here. But Yuri came over in 1970. He fled the Soviet Union from the position of working with the KGB. So he became a defector that then came to America specifically to warn them what he called was ideological subversion. And this is what we call nowadays fifth generation warfare, which is the info war, which is a way to change your enemy's ethos from the inside without ever having to shoot a bullet at them. Because it's, and this is something that Griffin brought up, the old Sun Tzu adage, if you can win a battle without ever fighting your enemy, that is the safest way to win a battle. And to be honest, it is the easiest way given enough time. That's the biggest thing, is it takes time to subvert a society ideologically.
It takes a generation.
It takes several generations too. This is something that Yuri laid out in a 4-step process in that interview. The first step, he said, can take 15 to 20 years because you have to bring up a new generation under a new ethos and teach the kids what the new generation is going to be, because they're going to become the new generation. And that's called demoralization. That's his first step. And when he says demoralization, we think of that word like, oh, I'm demoralized, I feel bad. But that's not what he means. He means literally excising the morals out of the society and implanting new ones. So there's a demoralization that takes an entire generation. After that is a destabilization, where the demoralized children become the new society and start to destabilize the stable structures that held it up. Then there's a crisis, and after that crisis is sort of a tongue-in-cheek fourth portion that he calls normalization. And this was a joke kind of to the KGB because they knew that normalization was basically totalization. At that point, you can institute a dictator over top of your destabilized, demoralized nation state that you essentially have taken over from the inside out. And he was incredibly concerned that they were very far into this process by 1984. Thankfully, the USSR collapsed before the beginning of the 90s because he said, like, we were coming up on our destabilization and crisis moments that were going to lead towards a normalization of basically Soviet America if it wasn't stopped. And that's what caused him to come over. And then again, looking retrospectively back to where we are now, there's so much of the same thing going on right now, where there's been a total demoralization of the America that we knew from the 1990s to the America that we know in the 2020s. It's so different. We've got absolutely steamrolled in the academies with cultural Marxism. We've got communist parties that are starting to rise up in Canada and in the US that are like, really? There's like college kids that are waving flags with a hammer and sickle and raising up placards with Karl Marx's face? Really? In Canada? Yep. That's happening, and that's seen as an academic good right now, a social good that is going to lead towards a destabilization. And once you get that destabilizing, then it just takes the correct application of crisis to lead towards a totalizing of power. And we saw, I think, a microcosm of that once we destabilized through the crisis of COVID. And all of a sudden, this tyranny started coming up, little bits of tyranny here and there and here and there. And we just acquiesced to it because we weren't ready for it. We didn't know what was going on. And we thought that we were still living in a stable society when, it was relied at that point upon the edifice of science, which by and large was cloaked in this ideology that we didn't know was there. And no matter what the ideology is, if it wants to take over, if it wants to subvert your culture, it needs to go through some version of those 4 steps. And I think that is a lot of what's going on right now. And it is a lot of what I speak to on the show for exactly that same reason that Yuri did.
Man, that was one of the biggest shockers during the pandemic for me, is watching everyone all across Canada just fold. Without question, just fold over their power, just fold over their thinking, just fold over their ideas. And it felt like, I don't think when it originally happened, I had yet watched that Yuri Bezmenov presentation, but when I did watch it, I was like, holy shit, that's what just happened. Mm-hmm. And my concern is, I don't think COVID was our true crisis. I don't think it was a big enough crisis to... we didn't instate a dictator, right? So if it was the crisis that whoever's doing this was pushing for, it didn't work. But given a big enough crisis...
what about an economic crisis? What if our dollar crashes? Now everybody's hurting. It doesn't matter if you have a vaccine status. Like, there are bigger crises that can, and we are tending towards right now, they can happen, that we're going to play round 2 of this game. And if people are ready to acquiesce and, think that the government's going to come and save them, they're in for a real shock. And here's the thing too, is when people think about communism and they think about the worst version of Soviet Russia, they think of like what happened many, many decades into that process. And they think, well, if I see that, I'll start worrying. But that's not how it works. It's very slow. It's, Solzhenitsyn called it the slow hand of solitaire. It's very slow moves, one step at a time, that play 10 steps down the road. And there was a time in, I think this was World War II. It could have been after that. I forget the exact point in history, but there was a portion of time where the Ukrainian people were being absolutely starved to death by Stalinist Russia. And this was called the Holodomor. 6 million people starved to death, basically saying that if you're a good communist, you're going to give over your work and your food to the people who are going to redistribute it to everybody because that's the utopia that we believe in. What was interesting about that, not just looking at the Holodomor and the people that had to survive and didn't survive it, but look at the Soviet people while it was happening. They didn't even believe it was happening while it was happening. It was considered a rumor and basically a conspiracy theory, where there would be people that were walking on foot from the Ukrainian wheat fields that were decimated to the big cities in Russia, and they would come gaunt and they would come starving to death. And the people in the Russian cities would look at them and not believe what they were saying was true. Well, that couldn't be true because, Comrade Stalin would never do that to his own people, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this reliance upon this appeal to authority, which can be a serious, serious problem when you're looking at objectively a different world around you, because people tend to, again, have this lazy perception of reality that's based upon the experts or the powerful people in society that tell me what's going on. Like, where's the talking head that I trust? Is it going to be the medical advisors? Is it going to be the scientists? Is it going to be the politicians? Is it going to be the comedian that has dancing vaccines? Like, tell me who is the person that I can trust, that I can just onboard all my information from and just call it a day. Well, what happens if those people that are doing that are the ones that are actually implementing the harms upon society? And what if they don't have a choice, if that's just the ideology that's driving the society at the time? Like, there are people in Russia at that time that would have loved to step out, but guess what? They end up in the gulag or worse. And so you end up in this false perception of reality that if you aren't attuned to the possibility of this metastasizing in your own culture, you're going to be blindsided by it.
Have you thought at all about what the antidote to that is? So what we're talking about is a mind poison. We're talking about a utopia, a matrix, an idea that is presented and repeated so that it's what is in our minds when what is in front of us doesn't present the same way. And we see this all throughout history. We see it every time communism rears its ugly head. The ideas behind communism sound amazing on paper, this perfect place where everyone is treated equally and everything's all good. But every time communism has been implemented, it's resulted in death, hunger, devastation, and destruction. And so human beings, here's a meta-analysis. Human beings are susceptible to getting caught up in ideas, even when what is in front of them is presenting different factual realities. Have you thought at all through your process? I mean, maybe this is what your book is about, your new book, because it's about truth. How do we come to the truths, and what is the antidote for the mind poison that we get caught up in?
There's a couple different ways that I can come at that, because historically, this is, like I said, you can go back into the past and see not only what happened, but then have sort of post-mortems that have been done on it after the fact. And one of the best ones when it comes to totalitarianism in general is Hannah Arendt's book called A History of Totalitarianism. It is very thick, it is very long, it is somewhat dry, but it gets to exactly sort of step by step what happened, how it was implemented, and how it finally collapsed upon itself. Because the thing about totalitarianism, or really any false reality that gets prescribed or onboarded as actual reality.
I want to interrupt you because I think it's important at this point in the conversation to clearly define totalitarianism. Can you do that for me as best you can?
Yeah, sure. So the simple definition of totalitarianism is a totalizing of everything together. So one version of this is fascism, which is a binding of state and corporatism. So the corporate bodies, the industry and the state combine as one union. Another version of this is socialism or communism, where everything is for the collective. This is a totalizing of everything together, where there is no difference, there is no layering of different substrata, there is no check or balances. It's a totalizing. Another version of this actually would be a monarchy or any form of unitary dictatorship where everything comes down to what the king says or what Stalin says or what the Führer says. You know, all of those are versions of totalizing control, which is totalitarianism. So it can form in all sorts of different ways. But to come back to Edward Griffin's conception of this, he said the thing that connects them all and the thing that is similar between them all is collectivism. So totalitarianism, it requires collectivism. And this is one of the things that is the antidote. The opposite of that is the antidote, of course, right? Because if you're thinking of something that is too far one direction, the antidote is going in the opposite direction. And in Hannah Arendt's work, she talked about the atomization of society, that to allow for totalitarianism to take root in society, you need to atomize society, which means no large groups, no powerful groups. Everybody has to be broken apart in some way. And I mean, we saw that over the pandemic where we were told to stay home, not interact with other people, 6 foot distance. Everything was taking people and groups apart from each other. And I don't know if that was the reason. You can conspiratize about that or not, but it definitely projected the possibility for any sort of totalitarian overreach or tyranny in any way, shape, or form to have fertile ground to work within, because in an atomized society, it's basically like putting people into solitary confinement, where how are you supposed to know what's really going on outside of your little bubble? You just have to take whatever information you get and just propose that it's true. And in that case, you can just feed people whatever you want. And so to take the power out of individuals, you actually individualize them in a strange way, which the opposite of that then is true, is you need to unify, but from a grassroots level up. This is the difference in layers, where if you try to impose from the top down, you're going to crush most of the people under your feet. But if you allow for reality to birth up from the ground, from the grassroots up, that is supposed to inform the upper level what's actually going on, not the other way around. And when you invert that, you're going to get that totalizing that happens. Another way of looking at this is to look at what it takes for these Soviet-style indoctrination campaigns to work, this ideological subversion, because what was the second step once you've demoralized is to destabilize. And I've talked to and listened to a lot of James Lindsay, who talks a lot about this at an academic as well as a philosophic level.
Yeah,
and
we just had him on.
Oh, great. Yeah. And his antidote is like, if you want to stop the cultural Marxism that's going on right now, they need to destabilize our society so that they can ensue chaos, cause their revolution, and then instantiate whatever happens after that. But they need the destabilization. So what is the obvious antidote? Create stability. Become stable, get grounded, be based, understand what's going on, and don't listen to or believe the nonsense that's being forced upon you. And this is a thing too, is a lot of people don't actually believe a lot of the cultural Marxism, the queer theory, the critical theory that's being pushed out there. They don't actually believe that men can be women and women can be men, but they're told that they have to say that they believe that. And that's good enough. They just have to say that they believe in the thing, or they don't oppose the thing, and that causes destabilization because reality is being presented as inverted. If you can destabilize, that allows for this ideological subversion to take root. So you just need to cause stability, reinforce stabilizing things. And we have societies that have been built upon stable edifices that we just need to believe in and reinforce and understand the value of, almost in a Chesterton's fence way, is if we remove this thing, it may have turned out to be a linchpin that collapses the whole tower. So maybe we should think about removing these things before we haphazardly start doing so.
Yeah. Create stability. That's really, really important. I think that freaks a lot of people out, not in a direct way, but I mean, I talk to people all the time about the state of our society and the state of the world and what's going on. And one of the things that I observe happening is that people get really, really drawn into and concerned about the war in Ukraine or what's going on with Hamas in Israel, or like, so that's foreign policy. But even at a national level, you know, the Trudeau government and, you know, all the damage that he's doing, and what are we going to do about, you know, how do we revolutionize Canada and all of this sort of stuff. And the ugly answer, and I kind of want your perspective on this, because you were talking about grassroots and kind of leading up toward the top. People get so caught up in like big pictures. Like, I, as little old me from Woodstock, Ontario, have no business informing foreign policy. That's not my job. So I should just stop worrying about it. So if I want to create stability, what do I have to do? Well, I have to look at the world in front of me. And I actually think that's part of the solution. And part of what fixes the mind poison is you actually just look at what's directly in front of you and you go, okay, cool. I'm going to look at my life from the framework of I'm going to create stability. What can I immediately affect in front of me that accomplishes that goal? Mm-hmm. It's certainly not. It's certainly not fixing the Russia-Ukraine battle. It's certainly not. It's certainly not single-handedly removing Trudeau from office. Like there are actionables right in front of you that, if you actually think about them, you can go out and you can make your life better. So, what do you think about that? How do you lead from the bottom up?
Yeah, well, that's the appropriate question to be asking that a lot of people miss. That's a meta level observation, is that, well, I'm not at a level that can actually cause affect onto the things that I'm most concerned about. So what am I actually doing? Psychologically, what you're actually doing is causing cognitive dissonance, where you have to believe two things at the same time that are opposite. You believe that the war in the Ukraine is a bad thing or that Trudeau is a bad thing, but you also simultaneously believe that it's your job to try to do something about it. Both of those things are not true. To believe that they're both true at the same time puts yourself into psychological turmoil and chaos. And to do so actually takes away your power to do anything worthwhile or useful in the world. And so the antidote to that is to come back to what I was talking about through Stoicism and Buddhism. And what do they talk about is recognizing in their position, we'll take the Buddhists, for example. They say that their position is that life is suffering. Suffering is everywhere. So the solution to that is not to correct all of the suffering, because that's basically like screaming at the waves to tell them to stop crashing. It's never going to stop, because it's literally the existence that is suffering. And so what you do instead is to come into resolution internally with yourself, to accept that and to become essentially stoic to it, where you can take the insults of reality and allow them to wash over you. Now, to come back to the psychological, if you decide or get caught up in the milieu of the day-to-day news cycle as if there's something you can do about it, you're actually taking yourself out of the equation of trying to fix that and putting yourself into a position of not useful to anybody, starting with yourself. You need to come back to the self. What am I useful for? How can I be useful, first of all, to myself? It's like when you're going down in a plane crash. Put your own oxygen mask on first before you help other people around you. But in that direction, in that trajectory, that's how it's supposed to work. Take care of yourself first. Then the people right around you. Maybe it's your family, maybe it's your brother, maybe it's your friends. And then out and out and out the rings go from there. But you can't start on ring number 270 if you haven't dealt with yourself first.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson talks about that all the time. He says, clean your room, take care of yourself first, and then maybe you'll be strong enough to take care of your family. Maybe you can, once you've got yourself sorted out, maybe you can take care of your family. And once you take care of your family and you have a strong family unit, maybe you can affect something in your community. And that's a mistake I see tons of people making, is they try to affect, or they think about affecting the federal government of Ontario and don't think about, what am I doing today to take care of myself? And I got caught up in that for sure during COVID.
Yeah, so did I.
I got so deep into that. And this is something else I wanted to talk about. Part of what plays into that is conspiracy theory, which is super interesting to me, because there's tons of theories, and some of them seem to be true and some of them don't. And they certainly are something that can easily get you caught up in them. And I'm not discounting their utility. I think there's a lot of truth out there that people are looking for, and occasionally someone stumbles onto something that actually really matters. But I think the right side of the aisle gets caught up in conspiracy theories pretty consistently, and it's another thing that distracts themselves from taking care of what's actually in front of them. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that? And how do you, look at Alex Jones, right? Alex Jones is this crazy man, and he's supposed to be this crazy conspiracy theorist. And yet he was talking about Epstein Island a decade before Epstein Island actually came out, officially. He was talking about it on the Joe Rogan podcast. So what utility, are those things worth any thought to us, or should we block them out the same way that we've kind of learned to block out the news cycle?
No, definitely not. But this is the problem that I hopefully have tried to illuminate in my second book, Layers of Truth, because basically the whole idea behind that book is that there is a total truth that exists. A total truth is akin to total reality, because if there is something true about every given thing, then there is a totalizing truth about all things as a unified thing. The problem being is that we can't know it all. In fact, we can't even know a little tiny bit of it within our entire life. So what we have to do, unfortunately, in an objective world, is to live subjectively. We can only do the best we can with the information that we have, basically. But the problem is that everybody is in that position. There's no one person who has the total truth. And so when they tell you they have the total truth, the best that they have is their proprietary ontology, their little pathway that they've built from the true things that they found here, there, and other words, and put lines of connection between them and present it to you as a truth. Now, when you recognize that that's the case, that every single individual person is just doing their best to try to build out a prescribed version of reality to help themselves for their own sake, then you can look at people and yourself with, I think, the correct amount of deference to say, okay, I can take some of these true things that Alex Jones is saying, and I don't have to onboard the entire worldview that he has to do so. It's like if you're going to eat a chicken, do you eat the meat or do you spit out the bones? You can do both, right? You can eat the meat and spit out the bones. You don't have to take it all in. There's some parts that's like the grain of salt thing, right? You don't need the whole dump of salt. Just a couple pinches here and there will add just enough flavor or enough perspective for you to have a more well-balanced perspective of your own, again, proprietary ontology. I keep using those words, but it's you're building for yourself what your own worldview is. And we don't have any other option but to do that. We don't have access to the total truth. And I make this argument in the third chapter of my book where I basically say that total truth, I use the word emet, which is a Hebrew word that I tried looking at a bunch of different languages for what their word for truth was, because the idea of truth that I was trying to project in this book, the word truth in the English language doesn't do it justice. Because you can talk about, well, I told the truth. Okay, well, you told your perspective. Okay, you believe your perspective, which to you makes it the truth, but what is the actual total objective truth? We don't really have a good word for that. The word emet in the Hebrew, after I went through about 4 different languages, I came across this one. It is consisted of 3 letters in their alphabet, the first, the middle, and the last letter, because it's meant to represent the total truth, the beginning, middle, and end, basically alpha and omega kind of thing. And in that perspective, we cannot know that. But in the theological perspective of total truth, that's an aspect of God. So it's basically like knowing God. And interestingly, of course, we can't know or be God. So to try to be that is almost an idolatizing of ourselves, where we think that we can know the total truth. It's like saying, I can be God. You can't. So the best that you can do is to try to do the best with what you got. And part of that is going out and trying to find true things out there and make your own estimations on their value. You cast value judgments on things all the time, consciously and subconsciously, which builds out what you think your actual reality is. And again, we don't have any choice but to do that. Everybody has to do that. And the less that we do that for ourselves, the more other people are going to do it for us. And again, that can lead towards a dissolution or even an onboarding of an intellectual virus.
Well, yeah, it leads to groupthink, which is something that we saw incredibly prevalently in the whole pandemic saga. So why don't you go through and just kind of outline the book, because I'm really interested in this idea of truth, and also include for us. This is not the only book you've written. The other one is called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. That's right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So is the new book and a continuation of your first, or is it an entirely new perspective and idea?
It is and it isn't in one certain way. So Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose is 27 chapters based around those 3 things. I have 9 chapters on consciousness, 9 chapters on reality, and 9 chapters on purpose. There is one construct that I presented in I think it was in the reality portion. It may have been actually in the consciousness, one or the other. But that construct I continued on into the second book. So that's really the only connection between the two. And this construct is what I consider is necessary for any individual person to have a well-balanced worldview. What you can't have is a totalizing worldview that is zero-sum as if you know all things, because that just leads to false realities. The balancing of your worldview is, I think, everybody's effort, and it's everybody's responsibility to do so. And to be able to balance a well-balanced worldview, in my estimation, requires 3 pillars. One is the pillar of the scientific, one is the pillar of the philosophic, and one is the pillar of the theologic. And I think a lot of people I think a lot of people either obfuscate one or 2 of them, or they just over-amplify one over the derision of the other 2, which causes an off-balancing. Think of housing a tabletop on top of 3 legs. If you make one taller than the other, it's going to off-balance that table. And so that construct was built in the first book and then onboarded into the second. But then I layered on top of it, no pun intended, the idea of layers of truth, where if there is a total truth, it is easier and I think more appropriate for us to try to delaminate them or bifurcate them in layers, because there can be true things that are true in different layers that can be caused as conflationary. So an easy example for the sake of social disorders nowadays is the trans issue, what some people would call gender dysphoria. This is a affect of the mind that believes it's in the wrong physical body as far as their sex is concerned. So they think that they're actually a woman, but their body is a man. At the level of the cognitive, that may be true that they believe that they're a woman, but at the level of the material, their body is not a woman. So you can't transpose that truth from one level or from one layer to the other and expect reality to represent that, because it's true all the way down to the chromosomes. You can't change what you have materially as your body. And this is just one example of, again, true things trying to be relegated to the wrong layer of truth. The cognitive, sure, I could believe that, and that's something that may pass or it may be, persistent, but it belongs in that layer. And to try to cast it onto another layer is just going to destroy that layer because it's untrue at that level. So I put those two things together in this book, and I tried to dissect. Specifically, I went into three major large chapters. One was truth in science, another was truth in philosophy, and the third was truth in theology. And I looked at the untruths in those three pillars, and I looked at the value of those three pillars, and then, of course, the unification of them and how they harmonize and add value to each other as this stabilizing force for a well-balanced worldview.
That sounds incredibly interesting. I find that a very refreshing perspective, because growing up in a religious community, really, if, I don't want to like bastardize this or like be dramatic about it, but like if it wasn't of the church or of God or of the Bible, then it didn't really matter. And there was no other consideration for anything else. And while I recognize religion and theology as an incredibly crucial aspect of living a well-directed life, I have learned as I've grown up that it's not the only thing that you need to consider. Do you consider yourself a religious man yourself, or like where do you kind of stand there?
I'll put it to you this way, because Carl Jung wrote a book in, I want to say, the 1940s called The Undiscovered Self. It's a very short book, but incredibly deep, incredibly deep. You can go through it in a day and actually have to go through it for a year. But there is a distinction that he made that I like to use in this area between what he calls religion and what he calls creeds. And he said, in his estimation, religion is an individual experiential qualia. It's something that you experience one-to-one, you to God, you to the universe. Whatever the religious experience you're having is something that you have to have yourself. And it's the belief and the reason why you have belief in any religious quality. Creeds are basically the bureaucracy or the orthodoxy that's built out as a community of people who have religious belief. And I would put myself as religious at the experiential level. I definitely believe in God. I have a lot of my own ideas about that may not fit every orthodoxy, especially Western orthodoxies. But I don't at this point nail myself to any given creed. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I have different terminology for that, but the same idea. But one of the terms overlap, which makes it confusing. I consider, and this is just my own thought, like my own thought process, but I think it was Jung who wrote The Undiscovered Self, right?
That's right, yeah.
Jung. So what he calls religion, I call faith.
Yes.
So I call faith the individual experiential idea of what you're engaging with that is outside of you and is meta and is beyond you. And I'm fully on board and believe 100% in that. And actually what I call religion is the creed, the rule, the order, the culture of whatever thing that you're prescribed to. I didn't expect the conversation to take this direction, but I've been very humbled by, so I grew up Christian. I consider myself a Christian, but I've been very humbled by experiencing other ideas and other religions and understanding and realizing how much overlap between the Christian story and other stories there are. For example, the Christian story is in no way the only story that includes a massive flood. There's many other religions that talk about that catastrophic of event.
Yeah, the Tale of Gilgamesh is one.
So what does that mean? Because, when you're taught to be a Christian, you're taught God is God, Jesus is Jesus, it's the only one, that's it, shut up. Yeah. And yet this experience, this story from the Bible that we're supposed to take as being true is echoed throughout a whole bunch of other different religions. That was a humbling experience for me to figure out. So it's actually kind of exciting. And we've talked a lot this podcast about your own reality and defining for yourself and thinking for yourself what is around you and trying to grapple with and understand the world that's presented to you for the purpose of distilling out of it truths. What do you see in the crosstalk between religion, and where do you find, where are you finding truth lies? And absolutely, honesty is encouraged and accepted here, because I'm on that own journey. Like, I'm on that journey myself. I'm just trying to understand. I think humanity is an incredibly massive and beautiful story, and I think that religion is a portion of it. But I think that I think as a Christian, I can learn from other people's ideas and other people's religions. And I actually think if I'm doing it properly, that will bring me closer to God and not further from him. What do you think?
Couldn't have said it better, to be honest. And this is something that I struggled with for a long time, because I was raised very ardently Christian until about my early 30s, where I was somewhat... actually entirely disabused of it along the line of material reductionism through the new atheists like Sam Harris. And I felt during the lead up to, but certainly during the pressures of the pandemic, like I was missing that pillar. I had let it atrophy. I had obfuscated it as useless and relegated it to garbage. I let it fallow for so long that when I needed the value that it had, it wasn't there for me anymore. And I had to recognize and introspect upon myself. Did I make a mistake? Did I get rid of something in that Chesterton's fence way where this was actually there for a reason and I didn't realize it and just believe somebody who said, just get rid of it because we're modern now? And in all of my own introspection and thought processes that led to some of the writing of this book, and I do speak to exactly what you're asking here in the book too, I both came back to the idea of Christianity as well as to the idea of God, but almost separately, so that they were already delaminated for me instead of presenting them both as totalizing. In so doing, I came across a couple peculiarities, like you were mentioning, like some of these similarities in other religions. The similarities were the first thing that started to pique my interest, and that they show in my first book more than my second. But I started to ask myself the question, well, wait, if God made everybody and all people are loved by God, would he only allow for salvation for people who knew the one story that salvation came through? And would it have to come through Muhammad, or would it have to come through Jesus? Or what if I was born and died in 3rd century Brazil? Like, there's too many people across the world that if God is real, there's something bigger to God than the stories that we're being told, is what I came to the conclusion of. And I think in so doing, again, my conception of God itself, himself, is bigger now than it was when I was tied to an orthodoxy. And I think it allows for me to be much more empathetic to people of differing perspectives and differing worldviews. And even as it comes to theology and spirituality, people are people, no matter where they were born, what language they speak, what geography they put their feet on. And that similarity is going to track in the value of God and of spirituality in general. And I think that if you stop othering every other person out there that doesn't go to your church or your specific denomination or your specific pastor, you know what I mean? Like, we get so tribal about this stuff that we do to ourselves what we think that we're supposed to be doing to others, which is opening doors. We're actually closing doors upon ourselves. And there's something to the discovery of God is more than just the books. God is more than just the preacher. God is experiential, firstly. Have you experienced God lately? Have you tried? If not, why not? And this should set you upon a path of actual self-discovery. And again, starting from the grassroots up and building out, like, what can I qualify as real? And I think that pillar of the theologic, which is basically akin to spirituality, it's I know that term can be laden to theologic, but it starts from the self, and it has to be a first person experience. And if you aren't having a first person experience, again, you're simply onboarding a recipe that somebody else made for you that has no value, no meaning, and you don't know for sure is true or not.
I love that, man. I love that. Is the book out? This is a portion of the book. I'm very, very excited to read this book. This is super interesting to me.
Yeah, so we've got a pre-order that's live right now, but it comes out right away. So it comes out April 1st. It will start shipping out to everybody, but you can pre-order your copy right now. It's called Layers of Truth. It's available on Amazon on Canada as well as the US. And I'm really excited to get it out there and get people's thoughts.
Do you experience God? How have you experienced God as of late?
Yeah, this is something I'm still continually trying to do. And part of that starts from the level of the philosophic, where I have to try to think and discern like how I'm going to go about it. But it all comes down to actually doing, right? And so it's partly meditative practices. It's partly just asking God questions and waiting for responses. And part of it too is looking at how other people have done it in the past, because I think that's what mostly the theological practices of orthodoxies are trying to do. And I said this in my book, and I think it's really important for people to recognize if spirituality, if knowing God and experiencing God is a first person experience, and experience is the defining factor of it, how, if you had a spiritual experience, would you pass that on to somebody else? Because you can't give them the experience. What you can do is lead them to have their own experience themselves. And I think that proper theologies are meant to do that. The books and the writings are supposed to guide people to have their own experiences, like the forebears before us that made it so valuable to write down and tell us in their written transmissions.
Yeah, so that can set a framework for how you read religious text.
Definitely.
How like, instead of trying to draw out specific rules or specific ideas, and I think I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think that there are specific ideas within those books that are meant to be around. And Peterson says it really, really well. He says, why have these stories survived thousands and thousands and thousands of years?
The collective unconscious.
There must be some utility to them. So you can't just toss them out the window. But I haven't thought about reading from the perspective of, where did the characters in this text go to experience the divine, and how did they lead their life in order to experience divinity? I think that's an interesting thing to chew on, for sure. Yeah, I like that. Well, Drew, I'm all out of time here. I really want to thank you again for being on the show. Just to recap for everyone, it will be in the show notes, both books, but his new book, Layers of Truth, Navigating the Objective from the Subjective, and his old book, Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose, are both available on Amazon. You can go get them there. Is there anything else you want to leave with the listeners, Drew? Social links, like where do people find you? There's your podcast. I'll link your podcast as well, but what else do you have going on?
That's basically it right now. You can go check out the books. Really appreciate all the people that are pre-ordering. It's helping us get up there in the Amazon algorithm, which is difficult without pre-orders. But if you want to hear more of my thoughts, I podcast 5 times a week on my own show. So check out the Social Disorder podcast. It's on all platforms, and you can hear me from Monday to Friday every week.
Amazing. I'm going to read your book, and then I want to have you back on to have a conversation. I mean, maybe we do 3 episodes. Maybe we do each pillar as an episode, and we'll kind of chew on them and dig through them together. But Drew, thank you so much for being here. I learn so much from you every time that you come on the show. I really appreciate what you're doing and what you stand for and all the work that you're doing. So thanks, man. You're an example of one of the good ones. So I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, I appreciate you too, Zach. Thanks for having me.